Welcome back to a new episode of the D League. This time it's episode 8. We are really close to our 10th anniversary, but that's off for 2 weeks now. And today, Bilal and I will be talking about game engines, a topic that I don't have that much of a clue about, but luckily Bilal is more knowledgeable, so
Hey.
I'll ask the newbie questions, and Bilal will be the expert for this episode. Bilal, maybe you can give our listeners a short overview about what actually is a game engine and what does it do.
Okay, yeah. So a game engine, I guess like probably the most is verbose the right word? Maybe the most vague, or I guess big description. That's like a basic one. Is that a game engine is basically anything that a game can be built upon or like used to create a game, and so I mean, a game engine can be just a code framework, like just some extra code that you carry around, like with you. For example, I have code that I always will drag over, and I keep it in this a Git submodule. That is code that I always reuse in every Unity project. So even that can be considered a game engine. But so that even just frameworks like Microsoft's XNA can be considered game engines. But what people are usually expecting as a game engine is some sort of full software suite that helps with every aspect of game engine, be it the audio and the visuals um, and the code and everything altogether. And maybe not even the code, maybe a visual scripting language. Um, and the examples of that would be like Unity or Unreal or CryEngine, the big ones, and things that are just frameworks. For like I said, I think Microsoft's XNA framework is probably the best example I can think of for a game engine that's just a framework. Really, that's why they don't really refer to it as a game engine. They always refer to it as a framework because it's mainly just code. So that's kind of an overview of what a game engine is and what we're going to be discussing today.
Okay, thanks for the explanation. So it's pretty much, yeah, like you said, just a framework to use for building a game on top, right?
Yeah.
So like you already mentioned three game engines, and from my kind of newbie perspective, uh, like the most popular or most well-known engine right now is probably Unreal Engine, at least for me. It's Unreal Engine 4. So I just did some research on the different engines, and like the licensing conditions are pretty different from engine to engine.
Mm-hmm.
So I would let's talk about Unreal Engine 4 first, and before we go into depth concerning the technology,
Yeah.
like the requirements and what the engine actually has as pros and cons. I would just like to give a short overview what Unreal Engine 4 licensing looks like. So Unreal Engine 4 is free to use, and if you have more than $3,000 per quarter in income, then you have to pay 5% royalty to Epic. And Unreal Engine has its own asset store where you can, well, buy and sell assets. So, for example, shaders or models, effects, and so on. And if you sell something on the asset store, then you get 70% of the revenue. So if you sell something for $1, then you would get 70 cents. and the other 30% would go to Epic. And for Unreal Engine, I checked if I could find some recommended computer specifications, like hardware, like the hardware specifications. But it was the only engine where I could not find any specific info, what's recommended or like minimum requirements. But from what I heard and read, I think you, as a user, you should have a pretty high spec computer to use it, due to all the effects and like the graphics potential is let's say really high. Like you can do really beautiful graphics in the UE4 engine. And also concerning platform support, it pretty much supports everything. So from Windows computers to Mac OS X, Linux, and even mobile platforms like Android and iOS. So it's for like my first impression is that Unreal Engine 4 is an engine that is kind of an all-rounder. You can use it for mobile games and computer games at different well, levels of complexity, like known, like current games, for example, Street Fighter V is using the Unreal Engine. I think Guilty Gear Xrd is using the Unreal Engine, but I think it's 3, not 4. And then you have the new Unreal Tournament, which of course is pretty much just like an engine demo game. So just to promote the engine. So Bilal, what else can you tell me about Unreal Engine if I'm interested in actually using it for game development?
Well, first I want to say, I think you said that Unreal Engine was the most known, which is interesting. Actually, I think that might be true, despite the fact that Unity is the most used engine right now. But I think players might know more about Unreal because of how long it's been out there, and you would always see, if you would always see that that logo that would come out. Sorry, what is it? Splash screen. There we go. You'd see the splash screen in all the games whenever a game would run through. Like Mass Effect 2 would show Unreal Engine. Even Mass Effect 1. So I mean, it's been around for a very long time. So it's kind of been one of the big engines that people would use in the industry for a while. Like it's been there longer than CryEngine. It's been there longer than Unity. And so people, so it's been more of an industry standard, I think. But I still believe that Unity is the most used one, just because of how the industry kind of opened up a lot more, and Unity is just like very easy to use, so people are always hopping into it, and when they learn, they like hop into Unity, and so it's got a big name. And like I think there was some crazy percentage on how many mobile games were made with Unity, like out of all of them. I can't remember what it was, but it was very, very high.
Let's postpone that until we talk about Unity. Tell me something about Unreal Engine.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting carried away. My point was that Unreal Engine was, I'm not sure about it being the most known, but it's not the most used. So there's that, which goes into the question of documentation. Its documentation is a lot better than it used to be, and I will say Unreal Engine 3 was, you would open it. It was called UDK at the time. Like you'd use UDK to make an Unreal Engine 3 game, which is the development kit. And whenever you'd hop into it, it would automatically, you would have these scripts running out of Unreal Tournament 3, and it was you would test a game, and it would pretty much just be a first-person shooter. And so obviously Unreal Engine 3 could be used for any game. but you would expect to make it for a shooter, like a first-person shooter. And so when they moved over to Unreal Engine 4, they started having more defaults to make it a lot more versatile. And so Unreal Engine 4 is like, yeah, they have the Paper 2D, which makes it easy to build 2D games and mobile games. So it can build for, the three main PC platforms, so Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it can also build for Android and iOS. So it has all that down, and the consoles as well, of course. And so I think on the aspect of it can obviously make any sort of game for any sort of platform. There's also the question of the graphics and can you run it and how does the workflow go through. And so I mean let's start with graphics. I think Unreal Engine has the most smooth graphics out of all of them, and it looks has very high quality. If you compare it to other CryEngine is more realistic, but it doesn't have the same kind of smoothness as the shaders do, I think. And compared to Unity doesn't really have many graphical defaults. They recently got a new shader, but it takes a lot more work to set it up. So one plus to Unreal Engine 4 is that when you hop in, it'll give you graphical assets that have this very high quality, smooth look. And they also offered, I don't know if it's still going on, but they give lots and lots and lots of free assets that look very good, but only for use in Unreal Engine games. So they kind of have you covered in terms of assets, at least in comparison to Unity. I'm not sure how it is with CryEngine, but you have a lot of high quality graphics out of the box with Unreal Engine 4. With that said, when I was using Unreal Engine 4, there are a couple things that were irritating. So one was when you were to use you almost have to use Visual Studio, not literally, when you're using CryEngine 3, Unreal Engine 4.
Unreal Engine.
Yeah. You can of course use a a text editor or a different IDE, but it doesn't communicate with Unreal Engine 4 as well as Visual Studio would. And the problem with that was if you compare loading a script in Unity versus Unreal Engine, you have to wait. I remember Visual Studio has this feature called IntelliSense, which basically will tell you if your code looks right. And it's very annoying to write code without it, at least C++ code, which is the requirement in Unreal Engine 4. And it kind of took on my computer. My computer was very strong, and I looked it up. Lots of people were reporting that it would take 10 seconds or 5 seconds, I can't remember. It was a very long period of time for the IntelliSense to refresh, which was actually completely awful for a development workflow. So I'm not quite sure how people got past that. Maybe they just wrote C++ code in, I don't know, some text editor. But that was one very annoying caveat. And the other thing was, every time you wanted to test the game, you couldn't simply go back to the editor and hit play like in Unity. You'd have to hit compile, which would take another long period of time for you to test your game. And so Unreal Engine 4 it's very hardware intensive. And I think you need Visual Studio. What was it? There was some extension for Visual Studio that some company related to tomatoes that was selling it. I don't remember what their name was, but their logo was a tomato or something. And I think it was called Visual Assist, I think. And people were always recommending that. So I mean, with Unreal Engine 4, you could expect to pay for things to make it run better. So I think Unreal Engine 4 kind of expects more premium users, and Unity will expect both premium users and, of course, new users, completely new indie game people who are not, or game developers who are not ready to spend anything. So,
Okay.
um, so yeah, just keep that in mind that you'd want a powerful machine and you want to be ready to pay for some performance upgrades if possible. Um, if you're using Unreal Engine 4. Um,
Mm.
so what else was nice about Unreal Engine 4 actually was there was this blueprint system, which is visual scripting, and that's out of the box totally free, right? Unity doesn't have any out of the box free visual scripting language. If you want visual scripting, you have to pay in some regard. Most people will pay for Playmaker, which is an asset on the asset store for Unity, but um, Unreal Engine will come with this blueprint system which can actually communicate with C++ scripts. So you could both use this visual scripting language that you would learn. So I mean, it took it has a learning curve and it takes getting used to. It has logic similar to code, and you would basically
Mm.
plug things in together, um, kind of like electrical engineering. Like it was basically a lot of logic, and calling functions and running code just like C, similar to C++, but not quite the same. It was very
Mm.
complex and good visual scripting language that lets you do basically whatever you wanted. And you could also communicate with it as a programmer if you wanted to do that as well. I don't know that I would use both of them at the same time. I'd probably use one or the other. Um, but it's nice that they have that functionality for allowing C++ to be seamless with blueprints, which, uh, yeah, that's anyway. So I talked about the visual scripting, and I guess what bothered me. But I mean, yeah, all in all, it's definitely a very strong engine. I'd say it helps you. It's not hard to prototype a certain look, but it's difficult to prototype a game. Um, and
Mm.
yeah, so I mean, if you look at if you look at C sharp versus C++, I mean, like think about it. Unity uses C sharp, um, Unreal Engine uses C++, for the most part. If we're talking about just the
Okay.
main programming languages, um, C++ you have to worry about a lot more than you do in C sharp, and that makes C++, it will just, when you're writing a C++ application, you're going to take more time than running a C sharp application, period. Like if you take somebody who's of equal skill at C sharp and C++, the C sharp guy will be done faster because you don't have to worry about memory management and garbage collection, which are some programming concepts. It's not too important you understand what they are, but they're things that make programming take a lot more time and a lot more thought. And so,
Okay.
the fact that Unreal Engine is a C++ engine makes it so that making games in Unreal Engine 4 will take longer than making games in Unity, and that's just how it is if
Mm.
you have equal skill in both engines. So that's just something to keep in mind. Um, but yeah, I think the main reason for using Unreal Engine 4 is its graphical ability and it's all of its out of the box features. It has everything out of the box, but Unity has more setup. And in terms of coding, Unity is faster coding, Unreal Engine 4 is slower coding. So I guess depending on your graphical goals, one or the other could take longer, but if it's just programming that's kind of the bottleneck in the development pipeline, then Unity will obviously not take as much time than Unreal Engine 4, for example. Um,
So you would say that Unreal Engine 4 is kind of less beginner friendly, I guess, because
yeah,
you are limited to C++ and it's, well, I guess, is there much of a difference between C sharp and C++?
yeah, there's a pretty
So
big
like you,
yeah, there's a pretty big
okay.
difference. It's a
So it's probably also more difficult to learn C++
mm-hmm.
than
Yeah,
C sharp, right?
yeah,
Okay, so kind of um, how could you say, like the startup time for you as a beginner to actually be able to use the Unreal Engine 4 to its full potential would take much longer than, well, booting up Unity or just starting with Unity.
Yeah, I would say that. But
Okay.
unless,
But
yeah,
yeah.
I think I don't. I mean, Blueprints is a pretty complex system, so it's not like it's visual scripting, so it's automatically incredibly beginner friendly, but it just doesn't have as much a learning curve as C++. So I think if
Mm,
you're using Blueprints, I think it's a question of, yeah, if you're not a programmer and you're going to use visual scripting, then Unreal Engine might be a better choice unless you're willing to get Playmaker for Unity. I haven't personally used Playmaker, but I've heard really great things about it, and it has really high ratings. And whenever somebody wants to do visual scripting in Unity, they'll recommend Playmaker. So I think if you're willing to do visual scripting, it can depend on. Yeah, I think if you're willing to do visual scripting, then Unity might be harder for you to get into just because you'd have to pay. So, I mean, if you were just learning, then maybe Unreal Engine 4 could be a good option if you didn't have a programmer and your game was more
okay.
art intensive. But if you're using the typical workflow, like with a programmer, then Unity will be more beginner friendly, I think so.
Okay, I see. Well, I guess that kind of explains why like big game studios are using Unreal Engine 4. I to be honest, I cannot think of like an indie game that's using Unreal Engine 4,
Yeah, they're
but maybe
usually
that's just me.
yeah, they're usually small. They're usually indie teams of about four if they're going to use Unreal, I think. Because one person Unreal projects are definitely not as common as the Unity ones, but yeah.
Okay, so now that you explained the advantages and disadvantages of Unreal Engine 4, you also mentioned Unity. So let's move on to Unity, and you already explained quite a lot about the engine. I guess is there actually anything we like you would like to go more into detail about Unity? Else,
Yeah, I mean,
I
I
would
think,
just
I mean, I mainly, yeah, it might have sounded like a lot, but I kind of brought up Unity stuff because it's hard to say. I don't know. It's hard to say how good an engine is without a comparison because it's not like engines have been. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, engines have not really been a well-known thing for a huge amount of time. It's kind of a more new concept that anybody can go ahead and grab an engine and use it. So
yeah, pretty much.
yeah. So I
Because
mean,
in the past you had to license everything right before you're actually able to use it, except if it's like an old game engine,
mhm.
like for example, Quake 3 gets released and they id Software uh, releases the source code for, let's say, Doom or Quake 1,
Yeah,
so the previous games.
yeah.
Something like that, I think happened in the past. But I guess, like, yeah, licensing game engines is like, or testing engines for free, like you said, is something new, or maybe it was
Mhm.
just not that well known in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's why publishers were a huge thing because if you wanted to get video back in your game, there was some crazy rates for it because what was it? I think Bink and Smacker was the product or company, I can't remember which, that would provide like video cutscenes for games, and they had some crazy license rates. And you probably, if you had a publisher, would get the license through the publisher. So so I mean, yeah, I mean, just little things from here and there in game development. They might seem little now, or like hard to get in. So anyway, but to explain like what I mean, Unity, like the advantages of Unity, I think um, one thing that's big in Unity that's not in Unreal is unless they've changed something very recently. When Unreal Engine 4 had become free, the features around that with any there wasn't any sort of dragging and dropping for inside of the editor to like say I want to spawn this thing here or that thing there. You would always use it was more of a coding type thing where you would use the constructor, which would create which is basically you writing a line of code, right, to spawn some sort of object. In Unity, you also use lines of code, but you can specify what. Basically, you can change variables by dragging and dropping objects. So kind of like in a map editor where you would save prefabs. So like a bunch of grouped things together would be a prefab, or like a model would be a prefab, or something with scripts attached would be a prefab. And so you could either drag that prefab into a scene and it would just be there whenever you play the scene, or you could drag it into some sort of variable, and then in code you could write that you want to spawn this object at this time. And so they make it really easy in Unity just to drag and drop, and even with the new UI, you just drag around things and put them in place and set their anchors. So Unity is really beginner friendly in that, and even professionals. I mean, anybody, like just dragging and dropping. If you know how to separate it and make it organized, like there's a huge advantage to dragging and dropping just because you save so much time not organizing how your code's going to look in that regard. You can just drag a button over here and tell it what to do with some options in the editor rather than having to write a bunch of code and organizing that and maybe having an XML file saying what the buttons are supposed to do. So it kind of makes everything easier in that regard. Which in Unreal was interesting because you could drag things into a scene, but you couldn't drag them onto a script or an object or anything like that. You would always organize things either through blueprints or C++ code, which are both scripting essentially. There wasn't really a visual drag and drop system as far as I know, unless something's changed. So that's something that makes Unity development really fast, as well as the C# that we mentioned. And you don't have to compile every single time. Like Unity will automatically do some. It'll look through your code whenever you jump back into the editor, which won't usually take very long. And then playing will not take that long either, so you can usually test your game a lot faster than in something like Unreal, where there's more overhead. But yeah, I think that's the big features are the new drag and drop UI, dragging and dropping objects around, and like how simple it is to kind of do anything really in comparison to some other engines. But where the problem with Unity is that they'll have some silly problems in Unity that might take a while to get fixed. And the other thing that's annoying is that there's a lot of stuff that you might expect in a game engine that you might be finding yourself going to the asset store and either purchasing or downloading free, because Unity, they'll take longer to fix something that you might take it for granted because another engine is doing it. And so I mean, it's mainly easier in general, but some features are limited in, I guess, in the aspect of procedural or random kind of stuff. The navigation's more recently getting better, but it wasn't really ever as strong as. It wasn't actually. You couldn't use it procedurally, so you could not make a new nav mesh or calculate new navigation at runtime. So if you wanted to generate random worlds, you could not use Unity's built-in nav mesh. I'm not 100% sure if that's changed yet, but if it isn't, they are changing it so that you can do that now. So kind of random levels were difficult to make. But like I said, yeah, there are just some small features here and there that would take forever to get fixed. was kind of irritating, and they would kind of point people to the asset store to just say, "Hey, go get that asset. It's pretty good." Until
Okay.
until they would actually fix it themselves, because I guess the team isn't as huge as Unreal. I mean, Unity wasn't really crazy huge until about like the era around Unity 5 when it started getting huge, and Unity 4.6 was when they updated the UI. So about 2 years ago is when Unity started getting crazy huge,
Okay.
and that's why development was kind of taking a while in that regard. But yeah, certainly. Oh yeah, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was the out of the box features. Like I said, Unreal Engine 4 has more. CryEngine 3 also probably has more. Uh, but in regards to like graphics, like I said, with Unity taking more effort, I think, to start it up, like you're gonna take more time making it look a certain way than you would, I think, with Unreal Engine 4 or CryEngine, because it doesn't. You have a lot of settings, and the shaders that look good are kind of new. So when you toss everything in a Unity scene, there's a lot more to configure, I think, to get it to look a certain way. And it doesn't have, but ultimately, if you were to take all the shaders out of Unreal Engine 4 and throw them in Unity, technically it would, of course, look the same, because data is data. Shaders are shaders. They're always going to look the same if they're in a different place. So if you got everything to look exactly the same, obviously Unity would look like Unreal Engine 4. But the difficulty is, of course, in configuring all of that and making sure that would look as good as you wanted it to, or maybe as cartoony as you wanted it to, depending on what you were looking for. So just something to keep in mind is that there will be more setup in the graphical regard, but you'll have a much easier time programming the logic, I think, in Unity, so than most other engines.
Okay. So Unity would be good if you already know how to create graphics, because if the coding is easier and like the graphics are, let's say, the difficult part, then if you have experience in kind of creating models and like adjusting shaders and lighting and so on, then you would be you could use your experience in that, well, in graphic design, and kind of balance the disadvantage of Unity, that it's more difficult to like set the correct settings.
Yeah, get it to look away. I think it's mainly the shaders. There's a new standard shader that has physically based rendering and allows you to make things look like a lot of different ways. But it's just it takes more configuration, and I think people are, if they want a game to look a certain way and the shader, like this is what I was talking about with like small features not being included, is maybe somebody wants a game to look like a little bit different than like what one Unity standard shader can reach or achieve, right? And so then they might find themselves having to write a different shader or buy an asset like Shader Forge or amplify a shader. So I think yeah, you would either want to be prepared to buy some sort of script that would create shaders for you, which I think nowadays actually that's a better workflow, is using one of the shader creators that kind of have a visual of allowing you to like put on different nodes and like drag things around. I'm not 100% sure on the options, but basically it's a visual way to create your shaders. Or people, find themselves writing their own shaders sometimes. So it's not something that I need to do, especially not for one of the common styles in Unity, which is the low poly kind of hard edges style. So you get hard shadows, kind of a brightish lighting. I mean, and so everything is kind of stylized in that. Not sure how to describe it, but basically low poly hard shadows is a common one, and that's not a very hard style to achieve. It just takes some configuration. Even if you were to do it in Unreal Engine 4, it would take a lot of configuration. But I think if you're just if you were to make an FPS that you wanted to look good, then obviously you'd hop into Unreal Engine 4 and you could get it looking how you wanted to a lot faster than you could, I think, in Unity. Just because the projects will take more setup, I think. But the standard shader does look a lot better than it used to. So, yeah, I think in terms of UI, like UI is probably going to be the same in all of them, unless well, obviously Unity has the drag and drop UI. I don't know if Unreal Engine 4 has that yet. So I mean, making a UI in Unity is faster than something else because you just go and make the visuals in Photoshop or grab some visuals off of the asset store and then change the colors. So I mean, making a UI is really easy. But I think, and making a model is the same thing. There's no real difference between all of the different engines. I think it's mainly the shader and lighting configuration that you have to worry about.
I mean, the model is always the same, right? Like
Yeah.
you have the model and the texture and animation, and then it's pretty much just the lighting and shaders and whatever other features the engine has that kind of changes, like the presentation of the model, that kind of makes it look different, right?
And so that's why you might be like, if you can't with the standard shader and standard lighting get your game to look a certain way that you were trying to achieve, which typically only happens if you're trying to look for a stylized high quality look. If you can't get to that with the standard shader, then you find yourself like, oh shit, now I have to either write one or maybe go and purchase a shader or a shader creator. So I think that's like one of the concerns is that you want to be sure that you can achieve the look that you can with the tools that you're gonna hop into like making the game with. So yeah, that would be my concern with Unity, I think.
How much is a shade like this the shading creator?
I don't actually know.
You have?
I know that what is it, Pixelogic, or I can't remember their name, but they have Shader Forge, I think. Yeah, I can't remember. I don't know how much they are, but I know that they're over $50. So I think it depends on the asset you grab. Yeah.
Okay, I see. So I guess the style you were talking about previously is kind of a cell shading style.
Not exactly
cell shading look.
Yeah, well, okay, so low poly is a bit different from cell shading. I think in that when you say low poly, some people expect like a kind of papery look, and some people expect just hard lighting and hard shadows. That's more of what low poly is, and with cell shading is more of a toon look. So like Team Fortress 2, like Team Fortress 2 isn't really low poly, but it has cell shading to make it look cartoony. So low poly isn't quite cell. It doesn't have to be cell shaded, but it can look good if it is, I think. It's more of, I was more describing that hard edged look like in the game Fez, which is like that 2D game, 2D and 3D game, that was made by some indie developer. Can't remember. But like that game had that look that I was talking about, where like one edge is kind of one color for the most part. So like the top of for example, if there's a cubicle pillar and the top of it is like completely white, like then the edge on the bottom right will be completely a darker gray, and then on another side it'll be just one other shade of gray, for example. So it's kind of like defined colors on each face of a polygon, I guess. Or sorry, of an object.
Okay, so before we move on to the other engines, let me just wrap up the licensing for Unity real quick. So Unity is free to use up to $1,000 of revenue or income,
Oh, 100.
then
100,000.
it starts from, huh?
I said 100,000, not just 1,000.
Yeah, 100,000. Then if you use a different license, like a paid license for which start from $35 a month, you have it's up to $200,000 that you can use that license, and then afterwards you would have to use the most expensive, the pro license.
Mm-hmm.
Else you would, well, kind of break the license agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, as you already said, Unity also has an asset store with paid and free assets. Also, like in Unreal Engine, you get 70% of the revenue when selling an asset. And for development, you can use the engine on Windows and Mac OS X.
Mm-hmm.
And Windows would be starting from Windows 7. Playing would be starting Windows XP and like Ubuntu 12.04 and Mac OS X. And as you already mentioned, you can also use Unity to develop for mobile devices starting from Android 4.1 and iOS 7.0.
Mm-hmm.
So for well, playing Unity engine-based games, the compatibility is pretty good, I think, because it even supports older operation systems.
Yeah.
And all right, so you already mentioned CryEngine. Is there? I guess you have not worked with CryEngine yourself, but do you have any like more in-depth information on the engine?
Yeah. So I think the graphic system is the most realistic out of any of the engines accessible to. I mean, maybe out of any of the engines out there. But I can't say that for sure. I know that when all the Crysis games were coming out, it definitely was like the most realistic engine out there. And so like the games will look more realistic like out of the box than Unreal Engine 4. Um, but Unreal Engine 4 I think had smoother graphics and had this kind of shader style. So basically CryEngine 3 like really realistic graphics. And I actually don't know what the main scripting language is, but I know that it has Lua support. I don't know if that's the primary coding language or if you can use Lua and something else like C++, for example, but I don't know. And actually, I do want to mention that I think I don't know what the newest game out of it is, but I know that Prey came out in May, and that's a game that was released in CryEngine 3. And CryEngine, it's also like a very FPS out of the box engine. It can be used for anything like all the other engines, or sorry, like Unreal and Unity. But I think like Unreal Engine 3, it would by default kind of hop you into an FPS mode. So so yeah, it's definitely a strong FPS engine. It has that kind of visual support, I think, for close-ups, basically. So so yeah, I obviously it does not. I don't think it has as big a community as the other engines. So maybe documentation is something that's more difficult to achieve. Yeah. And there's also the concern of the asset store. Obviously, Unity's is biggest, then Unreal's, then CryEngine's. So the asset store is probably limited in comparison to the other engines. So yeah, you might find yourself having to solve a lot of problems on your own. I'm not sure why I'm not sure about the advantages over, from CryEngine over Unreal Engine 4. I guess that might come from the licensing options, but I don't know about them actually. It's been a while since I've
Yeah,
checked it out.
I looked them up, and the advantage is that, well, CryEngine is also free,
Yeah.
but it's also royalty free.
Hmm.
So only if you need the support, um, then you can subscribe to, well, like some packages
Hmm.
for $50 or $150, I
Yeah.
think, per month. And then in this case, if you are a subscriber, then if you sell something through the asset store, you also get 80% of the revenue instead of 70
Hmm.
as a kind of a free user. And yeah, so I guess if you have a big studio, then and you say, okay, yeah, we're going to do all the assets ourselves anyway, and maybe we just need some support, then I guess the royalty-free aspect of the engine is a big plus,
Yeah.
because no matter how much revenue you make, uh, Crytek is seeing nothing of it.
Yeah. I guess they kind of have to do that now because Unreal and Unity, like, well, Unreal had to go free at some point. Like, they went free in 2015, I believe, and Unity also made all of its pro features available at the same time. So I guess, and then Unreal Engine, I guess, followed because competition. They kind of have to do something with this. Like, it has to be
Yeah,
free by default, at least, to use, and I guess the royalty free is like one of their options to make it work. So I guess they're kind of
yeah,
expecting more like professional studios to use it, which is why that support subscription is so high. Because like if a business is constantly paying that, then they'll, I guess, get the documentation they need out of support. So
yeah. Also, you can contact well, the company for, well, if you have questions, so you kind of have a direct support line,
yeah.
and they have a promise, or like the if you have the $50 subscription, then they help you in in uh, in a time period of 3 days.
Hmm.
And if you have the more expensive subscription, then they reply in 2 days, so higher priority.
Yeah.
um, I guess it, like, the engine is also more well, not only for professional users, so big game companies,
Hmm.
but the recommended hardware is well, not like entry level specs, but more mid-range to high range specifications.
Yeah.
So in this case, if you use CryEngine for building a game, it's kind of the same as when using Unreal Engine 4, that you are kind of expected to have a powerful computer that can, let's say, render properly or really quickly. Like for Unreal Engine 4, you needed to compile. You needed a strong computer to compile the game more
Yeah.
quickly.
Hmm.
And for CryEngine, I guess it's just like you said, the more realistic physics and so on. And if you test that, yeah, I guess low range, or yeah,
Hmm.
maybe a lower range, medium range specification, computer won't actually be sufficient to render everything.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one thing that I saw was pretty cool about CryEngine was they had a feature that would let you play the game like on multiple consoles at once. So you would see the game run on like I think plugged into the PC and then also an Xbox and a PS3. I think they did a live demo where they were doing that. So that was
Okay.
yeah. So I haven't actually seen that feature in any of the other engines. So that was something interesting. I know Unity does have a mobile app called Unity Remote where you can plug it into your computer and use the phone as input to test the game, like on the PC. So there's one similar example, but it didn't have anything like that for consoles, which was a pretty cool feature. But yeah, I don't. Beyond that, I'm not too well versed on CryEngine. I think that with the royalty free option, like I think if you're an indie developer and you were making games that you wanted to not have money taken from, I think like as a solo developer or a 2-man team, like you probably would use something like Unity anyway because games like that usually would not even hit 100K. So like, but I mean I'm not even sure how good CryEngine would be because I don't know if they have 2D features or not, and if they have 3D features, I mean you probably would have an easier time with Unity or Unreal making a like low poly kind of game. Um, but I
Yeah,
think
because you have just more support from the community,
yeah,
and
and because of like
yeah, as
yeah,
it's
because
called.
of the visual scripting language from Unreal or because of like dragging and dropping in Unity. But I think for an FPS game, like if you're making a game that just kind of uses the environment, that's like for example something like Dear Esther, which is like storytelling kind of first person. You just walk around and you're told a story rather than like real gameplay. Something simple like that would, I mean, Unreal Engine and Unity, or sorry, Unreal and CryEngine probably kind of match there. So, I mean, maybe something like that you'd want to use CryEngine because you wouldn't have to worry about the royalty from Unreal Engine 4 and you'd just be able to release that game. So, I mean, yeah, so I think it depends on. I think you'd probably only use CryEngine 3 if you were making, like, as an indie developer, if you were making some uh, game that needed more realistic graphics than Unreal, or if you wanted, or if you were making some game where you were going to hit over 3,000 revenue, and you were
Dollars,
going
yeah.
to, and it was like, yeah, I don't know, maybe something like Dear Esther, or just a first-person shooter. I mean, um,
Yeah.
something that's not too hard to make. Yeah.
I guess $3,000 is not much of a limit, right? At least, like if you have a promising game and you just kickstart it on a crowdfunding platform, then
Mm-hmm.
maybe already there you get more than $3,000.
Yeah.
So
If
yeah, in that case, maybe if especially if you want to create something first-person shooter like, then yeah, maybe give CryEngine 3 uh, just a try, see how it works, and maybe if it's something for you, and yeah, then yeah, maybe you can save some money by just trying out the engine instead of straight going for Unreal Engine 4.
yeah, sure. Anything that's like not too
Right.
crazy complex.
So I noted down 2 further engines that I guess we can talk about real quick, just a few minutes, not too long.
Okay.
And so the first would be, well, Spring RTS. We worked with it for a bit, and like the advantage is, well, if you want to create an RTS, it's free and royalty free. It's open source, and it's also very low spec friendly for playing.
Yeah.
Of course, only if you have low unit count. The more units there are on the screen, well, the more straining it is on the hardware. And well, my impression was that when you develop something in Spring RTS, then you should have a more powerful machine than low spec, so something like medium spec.
Yeah.
Something, like current hardware, not the most expensive hardware, but like a graphic card for $100 or $150. Because when I rendered maps, it took ages to kind of finish, and was a bit annoying. And there is a map editor for the engine, but it's difficult to use, let's say.
Yeah, I think the thing about Spring was that I think it had a really confused pipeline because Spring was like I was still a very long time ago that we used it, and I was not really a coder. Like that was like very long time, like 7 years ago or something. So I was like not really a programmer, and the scripting language was Lua, so it was very easy to learn like the programming language. But obviously, you had problems with documentation was not so clear, and you'd have to deal with like community members who didn't really, they were community members and they have the same kind of like attitude as a support would, or like people answering questions. So so that was kind of an annoying experience. But I mean, yeah. So it's an open source engine, so like everything was kind of disorganized. So like for example, the confused pipeline is described where there were multiple map editors, there were multiple. There was something called Upspring, which was for. Not even sure what it was for. It was basically for importing models, but it worked in this very weird way, and you would it was for like setting origins on your model, so you could say like, okay, let's grab this empty object to fire a bullet from whenever the unit shoots. But so yeah, I mean there was that, which was kind of weird. You didn't have to use it technically, but you could. And it was hard to it was hard to code the UI because that documentation kind of was non-existent in comparison to the game code. Like at least the game code was there. But the game code, like you'd have to search around for like everything that you could do and like all the events that would run on a unit. And so that was, I mean, yeah, it was a kind of, just because of the fact that it was open source, like it was, nobody's making money off of it, so it was difficult to have kind of an organized workflow or like know exactly how to do everything without having to ask random people or the engine developers, I guess. So
yeah,
the other,
guess if you
sorry, go ahead.
If you're really kind of frustration resistant, then maybe the Spring RTS is an engine that you can use. At least for me, I wanted to make some maps because most, or I think every map that is out for Spring is kind of let's say not really tile based, but more like random, not really random generated, but there are a lot of positional imbalances where you have like high ground on one side and it's not that much of a high ground on the other side of the map.
Yeah.
And so when I tried to create the map, you had a texture map and a height map. So you kind of made the height map in, I think I made it in GIMP.
Yeah, I remember
so
that.
Stuff like that. And the texture map, it would be, I'm not sure how much bigger it was. Like, let's say like the height map would be 500 times 500, and then like the texture map would need to be, I think, 8 times as big. So in the end, if you created it in GIMP, then you would have a texture map that is like 300 megabytes in size.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's it, like the texture map is for the whole map, and it's kind of, well, if you have height map and texture map separated, then okay, yeah, tough. It's really tough to align everything
Yeah.
perfectly to make it look good. At least that was something that frustrated me.
Yeah, the other thing that I want to bring up because I think it's relevant to any engine is like Spring had a lot of defaults like in the source code, which I think you would have to use hacky solutions to like change them. For example, moving while shooting and stuff like that were kind of engine defaults, and the same with if a unit was going to shoot at something, it could, I believe, it could shoot backward from its head. So like there are some default features which either you'd have to change, I think, in source or use a hacky solution, like just telling it to stop, basically. Like if it's like telling it not to shoot if its rotation, I think, was not like exact, or otherwise, fix, like maybe they had some obscure documentation that was hard to find that you'd be able to change it with. And so I think it's important for an engine, if it's an RTS, yeah, let's, I mean, with, for example, since this is an RTS engine, like um, if there's an RTS engine, then it should have the capability to change just about everything, because I mean, RTS in nature is numbers. Like it's a bunch of numbers and visuals that you can change, in that typically an RTS will run the same way. Either the units can move while shooting or they can't move while shooting for the most part. And then once it's beyond that, you just have the options of like what's a unit's acceleration, speed, attack damage, number of weapons, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important that all of that is really easy to change visually, like in data, either data files or a data editor like Unity's Inspector, or yeah. So, and the same with a map editor. Like a map editor should also be like accessible and easy to change stuff in. So the thing about like games like RTS is that it's important for the framework to allow you to change pretty much everything to be like the way that you want it to be, rather than a certain way, which I think was Spring's aim. But at the time, there was a lot of weird behavior that was similar to Supreme Commander, because they both kind of root from Total Annihilation, and that's what Spring RTS was based off of as well. So they kind of had a lot of different Total Annihilation spin-offs that were similar to the game, but just dependent on how the user or the developer wanted it to be. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting engine for sure, but yeah, I mean, it kind of falls has like pitfalls in terms of documentation, and the fact
usability.
That nobody's really maintaining everything. They're kind of just developers with some support. So yeah.
Yeah, and so last engine I just want to mention really quickly, because we are running out of time, is a RPG Maker. With the current version is RPG Maker MV. So as the name says, it's for RPGs. The full version costs around $80 right now, and it's for 2D RPGs only. So kind of old style JRPGs. And the pros are that it's kind of, you buy RPG Maker and you can just use it without needing to program or like even create characters. You can use assets, like it has the two different RPG battle types, like the Final Fantasy type, and something like in Mother. So where you see the characters on the side and they're attacking to the side, or like in front and attacking to like the background more. like that. And so if you are interested in, well, just RPGs, and you say, yeah, I wanted to do a 2D RPG, then maybe that's a good start, because there are some RPGs that actually were made in RPG Maker and made some money. So you can even use it to make a polished RPG, 2D RPG game. You just, well, as in every engine, I guess, just invest some time, and in this case, you would need to write a good script and good character profiles and so on. I mean, that's what makes a good RPG. So in this case, RPG Maker kind of gives you the ability to, if you can't do anything, then you can, well, you just need to be able to write some good script. And then maybe afterwards, if you say, okay, here's this script, and I implement it in RPG Maker, but I want the characters to look different, then maybe you can find somebody that's going to do some artwork, and then you just replace it and done. Yeah, so that's just something I want to mention, because we talked about FPS engine, RTS engine. I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think all of them can kind of be used for anything for the most part, except like RPG Maker, of course. Probably. But I think I did want to mention like the last thing I wanted to mention was there's another engine called Game Maker, which is it's kind of like, I think it's like RPG Maker, except obviously it's for any 2D game. And they have their own scripting language called GML. I think I'm not quite sure, but I know that I think it has some visual scripting features. But yeah, I know that that's an engine that's easier than Unity to use to make 2D indie games. So I just want to mention that to check out if you're interested in making only 2D games. So.
Okay. And before we end our podcast for this week, I just want to give a short question, quickie, let's say. I guess what people probably think about a lot when they're interested in creating a video game. So, is it easy to switch engines? So let's say you start in Unreal Engine and then you switch to Unity. Would that be possible?
Yeah, I think with anything that though there's always a different workflow to keep in mind, because like if you're a programmer, then obviously like switching from Ruby to C# or to like Java or to JavaScript to any of the dynamic higher level languages is very easy. From C# to C++, it's a little harder than with like C# to Java, obviously, because they look the same, or C# to a web language, because web languages are not very complex. They're pretty easy to learn. But when you have a game engine, like now you have so many other things to worry about, because there's an entire pipeline. You're not just programming, or you're not just, worrying about one thing. You now have to worry about like, how do we get assets in? How do we reference the assets? We have to worry about the engine's framework now, right? So like there's a code style that you need to get used to, or like a style of development that you need to get used to. So I mean, obviously you can switch from an engine to another one, but
it's difficult.
Yeah, there's always a learning curve depending on how easy it is to use it. So I mean, Unity programming is very different from regular programming. Not incredibly different, but there's like it works based on components talking to Unity rather than a single main function that drives everything. Like Unity will drive all of your scripts and let them run their respective functions, whereas in regular programming you would write the main function that would drive everything else happening in the game. So every engine kind of has its own style of allowing you to communicate with it. So I think you're always learning an engine. You're not switching from C# to C++. You're switching from Unity to Unreal, right? So you have to worry
Okay.
about that different style development in the pipeline.
Okay. So, I guess what some people will probably also think about is, should they use a commonly used engine like Unreal Engine, or rather go for a niche engine with less revenue share?
I think it. I think it
I
depends
guess for the
on.
first game, it's probably better to use a commonly used engine and then maybe switch to something else.
Well, that depends on how.
If
It depends on how the functionality of the engine, like how good is the engine, and it depends like can it do exactly what you're looking for, and it also matters. Um, sorry, you said it matters
like
for.
how much revenue you expect, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So it depends on how much revenue you expect to make. Like, are you just making a small game that you don't really care too much about what the revenue is, and you just want to get something out there, or do you expect to be making like $3,000 or $5,000 off of it? And so I think if I think it, I think I wouldn't worry too much about the revenue share. I think I would go for like the engine that suits it best, unless the revenue share is something crazy. Because I mean, for a first game, it's difficult first off to reach $3,000, and I think for future games, if you expect to hit over that, then probably the technology that'll help you get it done best is what's going to matter mostly, because then you can go and make more projects. So I mean, if you're making a 2D game, then you probably will end up using Game Maker. I know that if I make a 2D game, I'll use Unity just because that's what I'm used to, and I was always a programmer, so I love C Sharp. It's my favorite language, so I mean I'm used to Unity. I don't know that if you're totally beginner, you would want to jump into that. You'd probably want to jump into Game Maker, like I said.
Mm.
But if it's a 3D game,
Okay.
then maybe you do want to hop into Unity. And if you could pick up a visual scripting language out of the asset store, then you might want to do that too. Um,
Mm.
but but yeah, I mean, I think in terms of niche versus like saving money basically versus like a more common engine, I think yeah, I don't think that's too relevant. I would say most more on the side of using a community engine, but focus on whichever one that gets you the done with the game like best, or helps you
Okay.
like reach it most easily. I think.
Mm. And my last question is, I don't know how to code. Is there anything I should or can do to overcome this? One sentence. I give you one sentence below.
um, if you want to code, then obviously you can just go learn to code. If you're not interested in coding, then obviously use one of the engines that has a visual scripting language.
All right. Just one question. Can you use Unity or Unreal Engine 4 without coding?
Yes.
Yes or no? Yes? Okay. All right. Then that's it for this week. Concerning engines, I won't make a summary this week because I guess we summarized enough about the engine. So just listen to our engine talk again. And yeah, so any last comments, Bilal, except like cheering people on to just test different engines and what they like to
Just use one. Just hop into one and use it. Yeah. Whichever one seems to fit your goal most, do some research and start using one and stick to it. At least for making a first video game.
Mm. All right. My final comment is just find somebody that can use game engines. It's the easiest way. You get paid. You get paid, and you don't work with the game engine. Job done.
Exactly.
Congratulations.
Just give them like a percentage of it.
Yeah, but not less than 50%. Maybe 5.
exactly.
All
5%.
right, enough joking. Enough joking. That's the end of this week's
Okay.
podcast. So next week we'll be back with episode 9. So we are looking forward to having you listen to us again. If there's anything you would like to tell us about game engines, maybe there's some super awesome game engine that we forgot about because it's not that mainstream, then please tell us. Maybe it's interesting for us as well. Not for me, but for Bilal, for educational purpose. So, all right, then thanks for listening, and see you next week.